Any person that misses one salah, not two, one salah, you miss one salah for no reason. You're worse than a murderer, you're worse than a rapist, you're worse than a terrorist, you're worse than a pedophile in the eyes of Allah.
What can even be said when someone spouts such absurdity with a straight face? Seriously, what kind of warped moral compass would lead a person to claim that missing a prayer is worse than a terrorist attack? There is no context to make this acceptable. If someone genuinely believes this, is there even a sliver of hope for their reasoning faculties? I'm not so sure. But what I can offer are 10 reasons why this preacher's statement is not only foolish, but downright dangerous. This isn't just a case of religious zeal gone too far. It's a grotesque insult to every victim of terrorism, a slap in the face to basic human decency, and a textbook example of how blind dogma can corrupt one's sense of right and wrong. Let's get into it. 1. Think of the victims. Picture this. You survive a terrorist attack. Maybe you were stabbed. Maybe a bomb went off and you lost your leg. Maybe your child was shot, your sibling burned alive, or your entire family wiped out. Imagine living with the trauma, or worse. Imagine watching your mother beheaded by a jihadist. These are not abstract hypotheticals. These are real events that have shattered real lives. Now imagine, in the wake of that horror, some preacher approaches you and says, actually, in the eyes of Allah, someone who skips a single prayer without a valid excuse has done something even worse than all of that.
Any person that misses one salah, not two, one salah, you miss one salah for no reason. You're worse than a murderer, you're worse than a rapist, you're worse than a terrorist, you're worse than a pedophile in the eyes of Allah.
Let that sink in. This is not just delusion, it's cruelty. It is an outright perversion of morality, placing ritual negligence above mass murder. What kind of mind believes such a thing? How twisted does your worldview have to be to rank missed religious rituals above dismembered bodies and decapitated mothers? It's beyond offensive. It's evil. 2. Intent matters in morality. Here's something even a child understands. Intent matters. Accidentally knocking over a vase is not the same as smashing it in anger. Morally, intent changes everything. That's why children are quick to say, it was an accident. Now think about a terrorist. That act involves premeditation, hatred, and a conscious desire to inflict pain and fear. Nobody commits a terror attack by accident. It is deliberate evil. Compare that to someone who misses a prayer. Maybe they overslept. Maybe they forgot. Maybe they were tired or lazy. Maybe they just didn't want to. Is that ideal? No. But it's not malicious. There's no intent to harm, no victim, no destruction. Only a severely confused mind would say that laziness or forgetfulness is worse than intentional bloodshed. Basic morality tells us this. The desire to hurt others is far more evil than simply neglecting a ritual. Yet this preacher throws that moral compass in the trash. 3. The preacher's attitude diminishes the evil of terrorism. By saying that missing a prayer is worse than terrorism, this preacher is not just making a ridiculous comparison. He is trivializing terrorism itself. If skipping a prayer, something that doesn't physically hurt anyone, is worse, then what does that say about terrorism? Apparently it's no big deal. Something that maims, kills, traumatizes, and destroys lives is downgraded to less severe than a forgotten religious obligation. If missing a prayer is worse, then maybe terrorism is just a minor infraction. Just a mistake. Maybe we shouldn't be so upset when bombs go off or when people are stabbed on the street. That's the dangerous implication of this preacher's logic. This kind of thinking doesn't just insult the victims. It normalizes terrorism. It shifts the focus away from actual atrocities and redirects outrage toward minor infractions of religious ritual. That is a deeply destructive mindset. 4. This logic makes millions of Muslims worse than terrorists. Let's think about the implications of this preacher's claim. If missing a prayer is worse than terrorism, then by his logic, millions of Muslims are doing something worse than terrorism on a daily basis. In every Muslim-majority country, there are countless people who miss prayers, whether from fatigue, distraction, or simply not being devout. According to this preacher, they're not just sinners. They're worse than terrorists. And yet, many of these same preachers are eager to distance ordinary Muslims from terrorists, as they should. But then, with this twisted logic, they turn around and say, actually, What regular Muslims do every day is even worse. That's not just irrational. It's ironically Islamophobic, if such a thing existed. It makes Muslims look immoral according to Islamic standards, and it casts a shadow on millions of Muslims who are just trying to live their lives in peace. 5. It implies non-Muslims are inferior and immoral. This logic gets even darker when you apply it beyond the Muslim world. If missing a prayer is worse than terrorism, and if only Muslims are fulfilling the obligation to pray correctly, then what does that say about everyone else? It means all non-Muslims, every Christian, Jew, Hindu, Buddhist, atheist, are not just misguided, they are morally worse than terrorists. Not only are they missing prayers, they're praying to the wrong deity altogether, which many Islamic scholars argue is an even greater sin. And guess what? That fits perfectly with traditional Islamic doctrine. Surah 98-6 says, disbelievers are the worst of creatures. The very next verse, 98.7, calls believing Muslims the best of creatures. According to the Quran, there is a built-in moral hierarchy. Muslims are superior, non-Muslims are inferior, not just theologically, but morally. This preacher's statement is not a fringe view. It's a clear expression of a deeply supremacist doctrine that values ritual obedience over human life and elevates in-group piety over universal morality. 6. This Muslim is embarrassing other Muslims and Islam. Let's be clear. I am not claiming that all Muslims believe this. In fact, I suspect many Muslims would find this preacher's statement outrageous and embarrassing. But the damage is already done. This man chose to go public, attach his face and voice to this absurd claim, and in doing so, he drags the entire religion down with him. He's not just embarrassing himself, he's embarrassing Islam. And how do I know this makes even Muslims uncomfortable? Because one of them literally posted on Reddit, in the r/Islam subreddit, asking, is it really true that anyone who misses a prayer is worse than a murderer, terrorist, rapist? I am sure most of you saw that one video of the guy talking about that, but I find that hard to believe and I want to know if what he said is really true. And if so, I want sources to confirm what he said. The fact that this is even a question being asked sincerely, with doubt, is a monumental red flag. And unfortunately, the very first response was not a denial. It was a confirmation. The response quoted the revered Islamic scholar Ibn al-Qayyim, who said, no Muslims are in disagreement about the fact that intentionally leaving obligatory prayers is from the greatest of sins and from the most major of major sins, and that its sin is greater than the sin of murder, or unlawfully taking others' wealth, than the sin of fornication and adultery, theft, or drinking alcohol, and that the one who intentionally leaves a prayer faces the punishment of Allah and His wrath, His debasement in this life, and the hereafter. Let that sink in. According to this respected authority, whose quote is cited across multiple Islamic websites, intentionally missing a prayer is worse than rape, murder, theft, and alcohol abuse, possibly even combined. This is not just wrong, it is morally insane. And what makes this all the more disturbing is how far removed it is from basic moral reasoning found in other traditions. Take the Hebrew Bible, for instance. In Isaiah chapter 1, the prophet speaks directly to religious hypocrites, people who bring sacrifices, keep rituals, and perform prayers while living corrupt, violent lives. Here's what God says to them in Isaiah 1:15-17. When you spread out your hands in prayer, I hide my eyes from you. Even when you offer many prayers, I am not listening. Your hands are full of blood. Wash and make yourselves clean. Take your evil deeds out of my sight. Stop doing wrong. Learn to do right. Seek justice. Defend the oppressed. Take up the cause of the fatherless. Plead the case of the widow. In other words, rituals are worthless if you're a murderer. God doesn't want your prayers if your hands are full of blood. In fact, He rejects them. You think you can murder God's children and He will answer your prayers? Not a chance. But in this Islamic worldview, it's reversed. You could be a murderer, but if you pray, you're still better than the guy who skipped a prayer. It's completely backwards. Righteousness is reduced to ritual compliance, and actual harm to others is treated as a lesser offense. This preacher is not just spouting nonsense, he's exposing a moral crisis, and every Muslim who still has a conscience should call it out for what it is, a shameful distortion of morality. 7. This preacher reveals a deep failure within Islam. Let's step back and ask a bigger question. How is it even possible that a preacher could say something so clearly deranged and yet be taken seriously by anyone? This isn't just one crazy guy ranting in a basement. He's dressed in religious robes, speaking with authority, and clearly believes he's representing Islam. That alone is alarming. But it's more than just an individual failure. It's an indictment of the system that produced him. If this kind of warped moral judgment can grow within the Islamic tradition, if it can be taught, quoted, affirmed by scholars, and spread online, then we have to ask, what went wrong? Isn't Islam supposed to purify the soul? Isn't it supposed to make you wise, compassionate, and just? So why is it that we're hearing missing a prayer is worse than terrorism from someone who claims to be deeply religious? If this is what Islamic religious devotion leads to, twisted logic, moral blindness, and public declarations that insult the dead and elevate ritual above human life, then something is broken in the core. When your moral system ranks forgotten rituals above violent crime, that's not holiness. That's corruption. And if educated, devout Muslims are being led to believe this, it raises serious doubts about the foundations of the faith itself. 8. This kind of thinking encourages violence, especially against children. It gets even darker. Islamic tradition teaches that children should be trained to pray from the age of 7 and beaten if they don't comply by the age of 10. The hadith in Sunan Abi Dawud 495, graded Hasan Sahih, states, "The Messenger of Allah said, 'Command your children to pray when they become 7 years old, and beat them for it. Prayer, when they become 10 years old, and arrange their beds, to sleep, separately.'" Now let that hadith sit alongside what this preacher is saying. Missing a prayer is worse than terrorism. Put those ideas together in the mind of a parent who takes both seriously. You don't need to be a genius to see where this leads. If a child refuses to pray, and the parent believes prayer is more important than human life, more serious than terrorism or murder, then physical violence suddenly becomes justified. Not just justified, righteous. You're not punishing your child, you're saving them from a sin worse than mass murder. This is how abuse is normalized. This is how children are brutalized in the name of piety. And it all starts with a broken moral framework that elevates ritual over compassion and obedience over basic human decency. When you teach people that skipping a prayer is worse than stabbing a civilian, you're not just spreading bad theology, you're planting the seeds of cruelty. 9. This preacher is living proof that prayer doesn't work, at least not for him. Let's be honest. If this man is regularly praying for wisdom, understanding, and guidance, then he's walking proof that prayer, in his case, doesn't work. We're not talking about someone who just converted to Islam last week. This man is a preacher. He's likely been a Muslim for years, maybe decades, and he's presumably been praying 5 times a day, every day, asking Allah for guidance. And this is the result? This is the spiritual fruit of all those prayers? A man who lacks the moral clarity to distinguish between skipping a ritual and committing mass murder? It raises a very uncomfortable question. If prayer is supposed to purify your soul and sharpen your moral compass, how can someone be so utterly lost after years of devotion? I'm not saying that prayer is completely useless in all contexts, but if the result is a preacher who confidently says that terrorism is less evil than missing a prayer, then we need to admit, whatever spiritual system this is, it's clearly malfunctioning. If this is guidance from Allah, then it's no wonder many people start questioning the source. Because the kuffar, the disbelievers this man probably despises, have a better sense of morality than he does. 10. Passion and conviction don't make lies true. Look at the preacher's delivery. He's not hesitant. He's not uncertain. He's bold, dramatic, loud, and full of conviction. You can tell he really believes what he's saying, and that makes it all the more tragic, because what he's preaching isn't just false, it's dangerously false. Yet he proclaims it with the same tone that prophets use, as though he's delivering a divine revelation. Let this be a warning. Just because someone speaks with passion doesn't mean they're speaking the truth. Deep conviction is not evidence of righteousness. It's entirely possible to be sincerely wrong, and this preacher is a prime example. He would probably give his life for what he believes. But what he believes is an insult to God and to humanity. We cannot stay silent in the face of such moral perversion. The world needs truth, and truth requires people willing to call out evil, no matter how religious it looks on the outside. Being a light to the nations means standing up when falsehood is paraded as virtue and when rituals are elevated above justice, compassion, and life itself. This preacher has extinguished the light of God with his mouth. He has corrupted religion while accusing others of doing so. He embodies the very thing Islam claims to oppose, the distortion of truth. The world cannot succeed with leaders like this, and silence is not an option. So if you believe in truth, in goodness, and in real moral clarity, stand with us. Help expose this darkness. Like, share, comment, subscribe. Let's be the light. Thank you for listening.